Edward had always been a quiet presence in the lives of Charles and Catherine, a man who existed on the edges of their marriage like a piece of furniture everyone had grown accustomed to seeing, but no one really noticed anymore. He was Catherine's uncle, her mother's younger brother, a bachelor who had never married, and who lived alone in a small flat filled with books and classical music and the lingering scent of the pipe tobacco he had given up 10 years ago. To the outside world, Edward was simply the eccentric old relative who showed up at Christmas dinners and birthday parties, who always brought thoughtful gifts and asked polite questions, and then retreated back into his solitary existence before anyone could grow tired of his company. But behind his quiet eyes and gentle manners, Edward carried the weight of decades of observation. He had watched Catherine grow from a chubby-cheeked baby into a radiant bride, had stood at the back of the church when she married Charles, and felt his heart swell with pride at the way she glowed in her white dress. He had watched the early years of their marriage with satisfaction, noting the way Charles looked at his wife, the way his hand always found the small of her back, the way they finished each other's sentences and laughed at private jokes that no one else understood. For a while, Edward allowed himself to believe that Catherine had found the happiness she deserved, that her life would be filled with the kind of love and security that had always seemed to elude their family. Then Camilla had entered the picture. Edward could not pinpoint exactly when things had begun to change. It was not as though Camilla had arrived suddenly, like a storm sweeping across a clear sky. She had always been there, in a manner of speaking, a friend of friends, a face at parties, a name that cropped up in conversations with increasing frequency as the years passed. But at some point, Edward began to notice the way Charles's attention drifted when Camilla was in the room, the way his eyes followed her movements with a hunger that he tried, not very successfully, to hide. He noticed the way Catherine's smile became slightly fixed when Camilla's name was mentioned, the way her laughter came a beat too late, the way her hands gripped her wine glass a little too tightly. For years, Edward said nothing. It was not his place, he told himself. Catherine was a grown woman, capable of managing her own marriage. Charles was a good man, fundamentally decent, and surely whatever fascination Camilla held for him would pass. These things happened in long marriages, these small infatuations, these temporary distractions. The important thing was that Charles always came home to Catherine, that he continued to play the role of devoted husband, that their life together appeared, from the outside at least, to remain intact. But Edward was a man who noticed details, and the details he noticed troubled him deeply. He saw the way Catherine's eyes had lost some of their sparkle, the way her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. He heard the things she did not say, the pauses that stretched too long when anyone mentioned Charles and Camilla in the same breath. He felt, and with the instinct of someone who had spent his life observing human behavior from a safe distance, that something precious was slowly being destroyed, and that no one seemed willing to acknowledge it. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in autumn. Edward had stopped by the house to drop off a book he had borrowed from Charles months earlier, a biography of some obscure historical figure that he had never quite managed to finish. Catherine greeted him at the door with her usual warmth, but Edward noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her eyes were slightly red-rimmed, and there was a tightness around her mouth that he had learned to recognize over the years as a sign of suppressed emotion. "Charles isn't here," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "He's out with Camilla." The words were delivered flatly, without accusation, but Edward felt them like a physical blow. He followed Catherine into the kitchen, where she was halfway through preparing a meal that she would probably end up eating alone, and he watched as she resumed chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, her movements efficient but utterly devoid of joy. "How long?" Edward asked quietly, setting the book on the counter. Catherine's knife paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing its work. Does it matter? It matters to me. She was silent for a long moment, and Edward waited, understanding that she was deciding whether to let him in, whether to drop the careful facade she had maintained for so long. Finally, she set down the knife and turned to face him, and Edward was shocked to see that her eyes were dry. He had expected tears, but there were none. Instead, there was something worse, a kind of hollow resignation that spoke of wounds too deep for weeping. "I don't know exactly when it started," she said, her voice steady in a way that broke Edward's heart more than any trembling could have done. "I'm not sure Charles knows either. It just happened, gradually, the way things do when you're not paying attention. One day I looked at them across a dinner table and I realized that they existed in a world I wasn't part of. They had their own language, their own jokes, their own history. And I was just the wife, the woman he came home to, the one who kept the house and raised the children and made sure his life ran smoothly." Edward wanted to say something, to offer comfort or wisdom, or at least the reassurance of his presence. But the words would not come. He stood there, an old man in a bright kitchen, watching his niece drown in plain sight while the world went on around her as though nothing was wrong. "He still loves me," Catherine continued, and there was something almost pleading in her voice, as though she needed Edward to confirm this, to tell her she was not imagining things. "I know he does. It's just that he loves her too. And I don't know how to compete with that. I don't know how to be enough when I'm competing with someone who isn't me." That evening, Edward did something he had not done in years. He went to a pub, ordered a pint of bitter, and sat in a corner booth for hours, thinking. He thought about Catherine as a little girl, clutching his hand on walks through the park, trusting him to keep her safe. He thought about her wedding day, the way she had looked at Charles with such complete and unquestioning faith. He thought about all the small cruelties that accumulated in the space between love and obligation, all the ways that people hurt each other without ever intending to, all the damage done in the name of something that was not quite love and not quite habit. And he thought about Charles, a man he had genuinely liked for many years, a man who was not cruel or thoughtless or deliberately unkind, but who was also, Edward now understood, capable of causing profound pain without ever fully realizing it. Charles was a man who wanted things, who reached for what pleased him, who assumed that the people who loved him would understand, would forgive. I would wait patiently while he worked out what he wanted and who he wanted to be. By the time Edward left the pub, the night had grown cold and the streets were empty. He walked home slowly, his breath forming small clouds in the lamplight, and by the time he reached his flat, he knew what he had to do. It would not be easy. It might destroy his friendship with Charles, might create tensions that would ripple through the family for years. But Edward had spent his entire life being quiet, being careful, being the one who observed without intervening. For once, he would speak. For once, he would use his voice not to comment on the weather or inquire about someone's health, but to say something that mattered. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, Charles called and asked if Edward would like to have lunch. It was a casual invitation, the kind they had exchanged dozens of times over the years, but Edward understood immediately that this was not about food or companionship. Charles wanted something, perhaps advice, perhaps absolution, perhaps simply someone to listen while he talked about whatever was troubling him. Edward agreed to meet, and he hung up the phone with a strange sense of calm settling over him. The conversation he had been avoiding for years was finally going to happen. They met at a small restaurant near Edward's flat, a place they had frequented often in the past. Charles was already seated when Edward arrived, nursing a glass of wine and staring out the window with an expression of distracted preoccupation. He looked up as Edward approached and managed a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. And Edward sat down across from him, ordered a glass of the same wine, and waited. For a while, they made small talk. Charles asked about Edward's health, about his flat, about a book he had been meaning to read. Edward answered briefly, politely, but his attention was elsewhere. He was watching Charles's hands, the way they fidgeted with the stem of his wine glass, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the door as though he were expecting someone else to join them. He was watching the slight tension in Charles's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened whenever there was a pause in the conversation. This was a man carrying a heavy weight, Edward realized. A man who was struggling with something he did not know how to name. Finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, Charles set down his glass and looked directly at Edward. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something almost boyish, and Edward felt a flicker of the affection he had always felt for this man who had married his niece. "I need to talk to someone," Charles said quietly, "and I don't know who else to turn to. Catherine is obviously not an option. My friends all have their own opinions, their own agendas. But you've always been different, Edward. You listen. You don't judge. At least you don't let on if you do." Edward inclined his head slightly, neither confirming nor denying. "I'm here," he said simply. "I'll listen." Charles took a deep breath, and then the words began to pour out of him like water from a broken dam. He talked about Camilla, about the way she made him feel alive in a way he had forgotten was possible. He talked about Catherine, about his love for her, his guilt, his confusion. He talked about the impossible position he found himself in, torn between two women, two versions of himself, two different futures that seemed equally real and equally impossible. "I don't know what to do," Charles admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I love Catherine. I do. She's my wife, the mother of my children, my partner in everything that matters. But Camilla understands me in a way Catherine never has. She sees parts of me that Catherine doesn't even know exist. When I'm with her, I feel like I'm the person I was always meant to be. How do I choose between that and everything I've built with Catherine? How do I walk away from either of them without destroying myself in the process?" Edward listened to all of this without interruption, his face carefully neutral, his hands resting quietly on the table. When Charles finally fell silent, looking at Edward with an expression that mingled hope and fear in equal measure, Edward felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was his chance. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He could offer sympathy, understanding, the gentle reassurance that Charles seemed to be seeking, or he could say what needed to be said, regardless of the consequences. He chose truth. "You're asking the wrong question, Charles," Edward said, his voice quiet but steady. "You're asking how to choose, as though Catherine and Camilla are two equally valid options, two paths stretching out before you that you have to decide between. But that's not the situation at all. The situation is that you made a choice years ago, when you stood in front of everyone who mattered to you and promised to love Catherine for the rest of your life. That was your choice. Everything since then has just been distraction." Charles blinked, clearly taken aback by the directness of Edward's words. "I'm not saying I want to leave Catherine. I'm just trying to understand my feelings." "Your feelings," Edward repeated, and there was something in his voice that made Charles's eyes narrow slightly. "Let's talk about your feelings. You feel alive when you're with Camilla. You feel understood. You feel like the person you were always meant to be. And Catherine? What does she feel while you're off discovering yourself with another woman? What do you imagine goes through her mind when she's sitting alone in that house, waiting for you to come home, knowing that you've been with Camilla, knowing that part of you wishes you were still there?" Charles's face had gone pale. "That's not fair." "No," Edward agreed. "It's not fair. None of this is fair. But I'm not here to be fair, Charles. I'm here because I love Catherine, and I have watched her slowly disappear over the past few years, and I can't stay silent about it any longer." The silence that followed was heavy. charged with something that felt almost dangerous. Charles stared at Edward as though seeing him for the first time, this quiet old man who had suddenly become someone entirely unexpected. "You think I should leave Camilla?" Charles said finally. It was not a question. Edward shook his head slowly. "I think you should stop pretending that this is about choosing between two women. It's not. It's about deciding what kind of man you want to be. Catherine made her choice years ago. She chose you. She chose to build a life with you, to have your children, to stand by you through whatever came your way. She didn't do that because it was easy or convenient. She did it because she loved you, because she believed in you, because she thought you were worth betting her whole future on." Charles's jaw tightened. "And Camilla? Camilla is not your wife." Edward's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it now. "Camilla has not devoted her life to you. Camilla has not borne your children or built a home with you or made promises she intends to keep. Camilla is a possibility, a dream, a version of happiness that exists only in your imagination because it has never been tested by the reality of daily life. You don't know that. I know enough." Edward leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding Charles's with an intensity that made the younger man shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I know that Catherine deserves better than to be someone's second choice. I know that she deserves a husband who comes home to her because he wants to, not because he feels obligated. I know that she deserves to be loved the way Camilla is loved, fully and completely, and without reservation." Charles opened his mouth to respond, but Edward was not finished. The words that had been building inside him for years were finally spilling out, and there was no stopping them now. "Catherine deserves Camilla's place," Edward said quietly, and the words hung in the air between them like a judgment. "Not because she's better than Camilla, not because she's more deserving in some abstract way, but because she's the one who made the journey with you. She's the one who was there through the hard times and the good times and all the ordinary times in between. She's the one who knows your flaws and loves you anyway. She's the one who has invested her whole heart in this marriage, in this life, in you. And you're over here wondering whether the grass might be greener somewhere else." Charles looked as though he had been struck. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though he needed something solid to hold on to. For a long moment he said nothing, and Edward let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words settle over both of them. "I never thought of it that way," Charles whispered finally. "No," Edward agreed gently. "That's the problem. You've been so focused on what you want, what you feel, what you need, that you've forgotten to consider what Catherine deserves. And Charles, I'm telling you this because I care about you, because I've always liked you, because I believe you're a good man who has lost his way. But I'm also telling you because someone has to. Someone has to speak for Catherine, since she's too proud and too hurt to speak for herself." Charles's eyes glistened, and he looked away quickly, embarrassed by the emotion he could not quite hide. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice rough. "How do I fix this?" "I can't answer that for you," Edward said. "Only you can decide what comes next. But I can tell you this. Whatever you choose, I choose it completely. If you stay with Catherine, stay with all your heart. Let Camilla go, truly let her go, and give Catherine the marriage she deserves. And if you can't do that, if Camilla really is the one you can't live without, then have the courage to admit it. Be honest with Catherine, let her go, so she can find someone who will love her the way she deserves to be loved. But don't keep her in this limbo, Charles. Don't make her wait while you figure out what you want. She's waited long enough." The waiter appeared then, hovering uncertainly at the edge of their table, and Charles waved him away with an impatient gesture. When he looked back at Edward, there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like respect. "You're harder than I thought you were," Charles said. Then there was a hint of a smile in his voice, though his eyes remained serious. Edward shrugged slightly. "I'm not hard. I'm just tired of watching people I love hurt each other, and I'm too old to pretend anymore that silence is kindness." They sat for a while longer, not speaking, the weight of what had been said settling around them like a familiar presence. Finally, Charles reached for his wallet and laid some bills on the table, more than enough to cover both their meals. "I need to think," he said, standing. "I need to figure out what I really want, who I really am. Thank you, Edward, for telling me the truth, even if it wasn't what I wanted to hear." Edward nodded, watching as Charles walked out of the restaurant and disappeared into the gray afternoon. He sat there for a long time after Charles was gone, staring at the empty seat across from him, wondering whether he had done the right thing. He had spoken the truth, yes. He had said what needed to be said. But truth was a dangerous thing, capable of destroying as well as healing, and Edward had no way of knowing which direction the balance would tip. Days passed, then weeks. Edward heard nothing from Charles, and Catherine's phone calls were careful, guarded, full of the small talk that people use to avoid saying anything real. Edward did not push. He had said his piece, and now all he could do was wait, like everyone else, to see what would happen next. Then, on a cold December evening, Edward's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Catherine standing on his doorstep, her cheeks flushed with cold, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. Behind her, and in the darkness of the street, Edward could see Charles waiting beside the car, his hands in his pockets, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Can we come in?" Catherine asked, and her voice trembled slightly, though whether from cold or emotion, Edward could not tell. He stepped aside, and Catherine walked past him into the warm glow of his flat. Charles followed more slowly, meeting Edward's eyes with an expression that was difficult to read. There was something different about him, Edward noticed. Something lighter. Something settled. They sat in Edward's small living room, surrounded by his books and his memories and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to his parents. Catherine held Charles's hand, and Edward noticed the way her fingers interlaced with his, and the way she leaned slightly toward him as though drawn by an invisible force. "We wanted you to know first," Catherine said, her voice soft but steady. "Before anyone else, because you're the reason we're here." Edward looked at Charles, raising an eyebrow slightly. Charles took a deep breath. "I ended things with Camilla," he said quietly. "Completely. For good. And I told Catherine everything, all of it, every doubt and fear and moment of weakness I've had over the past few years. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but it was also the most honest." Edward waited, sensing there was more. "We're going to try," Catherine continued, squeezing Charles's hand. "Really try. Not just go back to the way things were, but build something new, something better. Charles is going to see a therapist. He worked through whatever it is that made him look outside our marriage for something he should have been finding with me. And I'm going to stop pretending that everything is fine when it's not. We're going to be honest with each other, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." Edward looked at them, these two people he loved, sitting on his worn sofa with their hands clasped together and their eyes full of hope and fear and determination. He thought about all the years he had spent watching from the sidelines, all the moments he had remained silent when he should have spoken, all the times he had convinced himself that it was not his place to intervene. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Both of you. This isn't going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." Catherine stood then and crossed the small space between them, wrapping her arms around Edward in a hug that surprised him with its warmth. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder, "for speaking up, for saying what no one else would say, for loving me enough to risk everything." Edward held her tightly, feeling the slight tremor in her shoulders, the dampness of tears against his shirt. Over her head, he caught Charles's eye, and something passed between them, something that felt like understanding, like forgiveness, like the beginning of a new kind of relationship. When Catherine finally pulled away, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, Charles stood and extended his hand to Edward. Edward took it, and for a moment they stood there, like two men who had found their way through a difficult passage and come out the other side. "I meant what I said," Edward told Charles quietly. "Catherine deserves everything. Don't forget that." "I won't," Charles promised. "I swear I won't." They left soon after, walking out into the cold December night with their arms around each other, and Edward stood at his window watching them go. The street was quiet, the houses dark, the stars hidden behind a layer of clouds. But somewhere in the distance, Edward could hear the sound of laughter, Catherine's laughter, bright and free in a way he had not heard in years. He turned away from the window and looked around his small flat, at the books and the photographs and all the accumulated evidence of a life lived mostly alone. For a moment, he felt a pang of something that might have been loneliness, might have been regret. But then he thought of Catherine's face when she had looked at Charles, the way her whole being had seemed to lean toward him, and the feeling passed. Edward had spent his life observing, watching, keeping his distance from the messy complications of human emotion. But today, he had stepped into the arena. Today, he had spoken words that changed everything. And whatever happened next, whatever twists and turns lay ahead for Catherine and Charles, Edward would know that he had played his part. He had loved them enough to tell the truth, and in the end, that was all anyone could do. The weeks that followed were not easy. Edward heard about the struggles through brief phone calls and occasional visits, the way old habits died hard, the way trust had to be rebuilt one small moment at a time. There were setbacks, arguments, moments when it seemed easier to give up than to keep fighting, but there were also small victories. A shared laugh over breakfast, a hand reached for in the dark, a conversation that went on long past midnight. Slowly, gradually, something began to shift. The tension in Catherine's voice eased, replaced by something warmer, more relaxed. Charles stopped looking away when Camilla's name was mentioned in conversation, stopped fidgeting with nervous energy whenever the topic of marriage came up. They began to appear together at family gatherings as a united front, their hands finding each other naturally, their eyes meeting across crowded rooms with the easy intimacy of people who had rediscovered each other. And Edward watched it all with a quiet satisfaction, asking no credit, seeking no recognition. He had done what he set out to do, and now he could step back into the background, return to his books and his quiet evenings and his comfortable solitude. But something had changed in him, too. He found himself picking up the phone more often, accepting invitations he would once have declined, making an effort to be present in ways he had avoided for years. One evening, Catherine stopped by his flat with a bottle of wine and a takeaway container of his favorite Indian food. They ate at his small kitchen table, talking about nothing in particular, and Edward realized with a start that he was happy. Not just content, not just comfortable, but genuinely, unexpectedly happy. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine said as they finished their meal. And Edward nodded, and she continued, her voice thoughtful. "That day, when you talked to Charles, what made you say it? What made you take that risk?" Edward considered the question for a long moment, turning it over in his mind. "I suppose," he said finally, "I realized that I had spent my whole life playing it safe, keeping my head down, staying out of trouble, never saying anything that might cause conflict or discomfort. And where had it gotten me? I was alone, Catherine. Not lonely, necessarily, but alone. And I watched you going through the same thing I had chosen, the same isolation, the same silent acceptance of less than you deserved. I couldn't watch it anymore. I couldn't let you make the same mistakes I made. Catherine reached across the table and took his hand, her eyes glistening. You're not alone anymore, Uncle Edward. You have us. You'll always have us. Edward squeezed her hand, not trusting himself to speak. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of his small flat and the love of his niece and the knowledge that he had made a difference, Edward understood something he had spent his whole life missing. It was not enough to observe life from a safe distance. It was not enough to love people quietly, privately, without ever putting that love at risk. Love demanded action. Love required courage. Love meant speaking up even when silence was easier, even when the truth might hurt, even when there was no guarantee that anything would change. The words he had spoken to Charles had changed everything, yes. But they had also changed Edward himself. They had pulled him out of the shadows and into the light, and connected him to the people he loved in ways he had never allowed himself to imagine. And as he sat there in his kitchen, holding his niece's hand and listening to the comfortable silence of the evening, Edward knew that whatever happened next, he would never go back to being the quiet observer, the man on the sidelines, the one who watched but never participated. He had found his voice, and he intended to use it. Years later, when people asked Catherine about the turning point in her marriage, the moment when everything began to change, she would tell them about her Uncle Edward, not a dramatic figure, not a hero in any conventional sense, just a quiet man who had loved her enough to speak the truth. And she would describe the words he had spoken, words that had cut through years of denial and confusion and self-deception. Words that had reminded her husband what really mattered, words that had given them both a second chance at happiness. Catherine deserves Camilla's place, Edward had said. And in those 6 simple words, he had changed everything.